Okay, so I published part 0 of my thoughts on this book, Faces of Environmental Racism, Confronting Issues of Global Justice, by Laura Restra and Peter Wenz. In that part, I reviewed the foreword and the introduction. Just as a reminder, this book was published in 1995, so some of this stuff is out of date, some of it still holds up to this day, and some of it just gives us insight into the past. So in this part, I'm going to be talking about Chapter 1, Decision Making, and possibly Chapter 2, which is Environmental Justice, a National Priority. So my first note on this is on Chapter 1, page 3, it says, even the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, was not designed to address environmental policies and practices that result in unfair outcomes. The agency has yet to conduct a single piece of disparate impact research using primary data. In fact, the current environmental protection paradigm has institutionalized unequal enforcement, traded human health for profit, placed the burden of proof on the victims rather than the polluting industry, legitimized human exposure to harmful substances, promoted risky technologies such as incinerators, exploited the vulnerability of economically and politically disenfranchised communities, subsidized ecological destruction, created an industry around risk assessment, delayed cleanup actions, and failed to develop pollution prevention as the overarching and dominant strategy. So on this, I made a note asking, have they done a primary data disparate impact research study today? And if so, did Trump delete it because of his war on DEI? I also made a note saying about incinerators, I never even considered the risks involved in that. And then I also noted this whole list is amazing, by the way. To clarify on that incinerator portion, I attended an environmental science class when I was in high school. And in that environmental science class, my teachers talked about landfills, incineration of waste, and different methods of waste disposal. And incineration was generally viewed as a higher sustainability option. But we never really went through what that means for the communities surrounding the incinerator. People who are, surrounded by technologies that'll release a bunch of gases and stuff into the atmosphere, how that'll impact their health. The book continues, as a result, low-income and minority communities continue to bear greater health and environmental burdens, while the more affluent and white communities receive the bulk of the benefits. The book then reinforces the statements that race correlation with environmental hazards is stronger than class correlation. I'll read this next quote out. And researchers at Argonne National Laboratory recently found that in 1990, 437 of the 3,109 counties and independent cities failed to meet at least one of the EPA ambient air quality standards. 57% of whites, 65% of African Americans, and 80% of Hispanics live in 437 counties with substandard air quality. Out of the whole population, a total of 33% of whites, 50% of African Americans, and 60% of Hispanics live in the 136 counties in which 2 or more air pollutants exceed standards. The percentage living in the 29 counties designated as non-attainment areas for 3 or more pollutants are 12% of whites, 20% of African Americans, and 31% of Hispanics. I find the next paragraph interesting. It talks about air pollution and rise in asthma-related deaths. So, for example, scientists are at a loss to explain the rising number of deaths from asthma in recent years. However, it is known that persons suffering from asthma are particularly sensitive to the effects of carbon monoxide, sulfur dioxide, particulate matter, ozone, and oxides of nitrogen. Unequal environmental protection undermines 3 basic types of equity: procedural, geographic, and social. So procedural equity is the fairness in law application. Examples the book gives are of inequity in that respect is unequal protection results from non-scientific and undemocratic decisions such as exclusionary practices, conflicts of interest, public hearings held in remote locations and at inconvenient times, and use of only English to communicate with and conduct hearings for non-English speaking communities. Some of those I'm still a little confused about. I know that they're inequities, but I don't know how they go into fairness of enforcement, evaluation criteria, regulations, and governing rules applied in a non-discriminatory way, because I feel like that would be more in social and geographic. But yeah, I'll read a little bit more on this outside of this book whenever I finish this book to get a better understanding. So these next bits are pulled from after examining census data, civil court dockets, and EPA's own record of performance at 1,177 Superfund toxic waste sites, the authors of the National Law Journal reported the following. I was going to pick especially bad ones, but they're all especially bad. So, penalties applied under hazardous waste laws at sites having the greatest white population were 500% higher than penalties at sites with the greatest minority population. Penalties averaged out at $335,566 at sites in white areas, but just $55,318 at sites in minority areas. The disparity in penalties applied under the toxic waste law correlates with race alone, not income. The average penalty in areas with the lowest median income is $113,491, 3% more than the average penalty in areas with the highest median income. For all the federal environmental laws aimed at protecting citizens from air, water, and waste pollution, penalties for noncompliance were 46% higher in white communities than in minority communities. Under the Superfund cleanup program, abandoned hazardous waste sites in minority areas take 20% longer to be placed on the national priority list than do those in white areas. In more than half of the 10 autonomous regions that administer EPA programs around the country, action on cleanup at Superfund sites begins from 12 to 42% later at minority sites than at white sites. For minority sites, EPA chooses containment, the capping or walling off of hazardous waste dump site, 7% more frequently than the cleanup method preferred under the law, permanent treatment to eliminate the waste or rid it of its toxins. For white sites, EPA orders permanent treatment 22% more often than containment. To summarize that, laws regarding hazardous waste were higher in white communities, so people who dumped hazardous waste in white communities were penalized more than people who dumped hazardous waste in minority communities. That disparity in penalties, so the difference between those penalties being applied was rated with race, not income. Meaning that if you were white and poor, you were more likely to be protected from hazardous waste than if you were black and rich. Hazardous waste sites in minority areas took longer to be prioritized by law to be cleaned up or contained than those in white areas. So white areas had priority put on them over minority areas. Even when they were prioritized, at least I believe that's what it's saying, like when it was put on a priority list, they were taking longer to have action taken on them. So they were putting them on the priority list and then not doing anything about it until later if they were minorities, but doing it sooner if they were white. And when they did treat it in minority communities, they would just contain or wall off the hazards instead of treating it to eliminate the waste or get rid of it being toxic. Whereas in white communities, they were way more likely to treat it than they were to just wall it off. I made a note here that this makes me think of that one nuclear waste site. Is it by civilization? So in that, I'm talking about, I don't know the name of it off the top of my head, I'll search it up, but it's a nuclear waste site, and I believe it's Arizona, Nevada, or New Mexico, that is walled off, and it has a bunch of signs on it in different languages saying basically, don't go in here because it's got nuclear waste. So it looks like the one I was thinking of was the Waste Isolation Pilot Plant in New Mexico. Licensed to store transuranic radioactive waste for 10,000 years. I'm checking the demographics, and it's saying that generally the average amount of, demographics, at least racially, in the United States, Eddy County, which is where the waste isolation pilot plant is set at, has a higher Hispanic population. So I'm wondering if what this book is saying has to do with that. I'm not sure exactly, but I'd need to look into it. The area, I will add, is majority white, being about 77% white or Caucasian. It is, I believe, it says 77.4% white, but also that Hispanic or Latino origin made up 44.1% of the population. So I don't know if there's crossover and that's why it's saying that. I don't know, the way demographics are measured is really confusing. In searching that, I did find another article about Yucca Mountain, which was a proposed nuclear waste site, but that was, I believe, scrapped. I'm not entirely sure. I need to look into this article real quick. Yes, so it says in 2010, Congress had abandoned plans to turn Yucca Mountain, about 100 miles northwest of Las Vegas, into the nation's only federal dump for nuclear waste so radioactive it requires permanent isolation. And the House recently voted a wide margin to resume these efforts. So this article was published in 2018, so I'm wondering if it was scrapped again. It says 2/3 of Nevadans oppose this plan, according to a 2017 poll. So it talks about how tourism was central to Nevada's economy, and that federal projects provided Nevada with the ability to get more money and water to survive, like the Hoover Dam. I'll quote this next part. World War II and the Cold War prompted numerous federal projects that benefited southern Nevada. A wartime gunnery school evolved into Nellis Air Force Base, and a magnesium plant led to the founding of the city of Henderson. In 1951, seeking a cheaper domestic location for nuclear tests and research, the Atomic Energy Commission chose part of Nellis. Until 1963, the Nevada test site was the scene of about 100 above-ground atomic tests, with more than 800 additional underground tests to follow until nuclear testing ceased in 1992. When above-ground testing began, Nevada cashed in. The governor welcomed the chance to see the desert blooming with atoms. Las Vegas marketed the mushroom cloud as a tourist attraction, as well as an atomic hairdo and cocktail. Atomic Energy Commission pamphlets and videos declared the tests to be harmless to those living nearby. The governor welcomed the chance to see the desert blooming with atoms. That's insane. So now it's talking about distrusting the government, basically saying, Nevadans learned about the health dangers associated with nuclear fallout, and so they trusted the government less when they were saying, because they were saying the tests were harmless to those living nearby, they weren't harmless. So as nuclear testing waned, I'm going to read this just straight from the article. As nuclear testing waned, the federal government scrambled to find somewhere to stow the spent fuel from nuclear power plants that have piled up in 39 states. In 1982, Congress approved a plan for the consideration of sites in Washington, Texas, and Nevada. But 5 years later, without getting conclusive findings based on these studies, lawmakers voted to consider only one site, Yucca Mountain, about 20 miles west of the dump for less radioactive nuclear waste in Beatty. The state's leaders and pundits protested this Screw Nevada bill, which they ascribed to the state's lack of political clout. When former President Barack Obama took office and had to depend on Reed's help, he ended funding for Yucca Mountain. So it seems like the 2018 reintroduction of the project was also abandoned. I'll try to put that article that I was reading in the description of the video. I'm going back to the book now. Geographic equity is in regards to proximity to hazards and locally unwanted land uses, which are called LMAOOOs in this book. So it says hazardous waste incinerators are not randomly scattered across the landscape. Communities with hazardous waste incinerators generally have large minority populations, low income, and low property values. It gives stats for this. So communities where incinerators are proposed for construction have minority populations that are 60% higher than the national average. The average income in communities with existing incinerators is 15% lower than the national average. Property values in communities that host incinerators are 38% lower than the national average, and average property values are 35% lower in communities where incinerators have been proposed. Talks about segregated enclaves in Chicago, and then goes on to state about how segregated communities were established, and then the communities that were majority minority communities, if that makes sense, were encircled by municipal and hazardous waste landfills, toxic waste incinerators, grain elevators, sewage treatment facilities, smelters, steel mills, and a host of other polluting industries. So they got a segregated community, they put minority populations in the center, and they just surrounded it with hazardous waste, landfills, and stuff. That is reprehensible to me. The book talks about Los Angeles, about how the most polluted area in Los Angeles is majority African American and Latino. It says some 18 industrial firms in 1989 discharged more than 33 million pounds of waste chemicals into the environment. So it talks about how people in minority communities are unequally protected from land use decisions. So, for example, if they're rezoning their land from residential to industrial to be able to put a bunch of polluting garbage in there, and that makes me wonder about zoning laws in general. So I've heard a lot about zoning laws being used to put car dependency in neighborhoods and making sure that people rely on their their automobiles to be able to get from point A to point B because they can't use their legs to walk, because things will be a 15-minute drive away from point A to point B. If it's put closer, then it would be easier to get there, but that goes against zoning laws. And I'm wondering, how can zoning laws be applied in a way that doesn't require automobile dependency, but also doesn't get weaponized to put industrial waste in neighborhoods? It should be a simple solution, but it seems like people will put a bunch of loopholes just to make it easier for them to either pollute or benefit the oil industry in other ways. It also has a paragraph on Native American communities and reservations being used for environmentally hazardous materials to be dumped. It says, because of less stringent environmental regulations than those at the state and federal levels, Native American reservations from New York to California have become prime targets for risky technologies. Indian natives do not fall under state jurisdiction. Similarly, reservations have been described as the lands the feds forgot. More than 100 industries, ranging from solid waste landfills to hazardous waste incinerators and nuclear waste storage facilities, have targeted reservations. So next it talks about social equity, which is the consideration of sociological factors in decision making. So from the examples, I think it's saying basically if communities are majority poor and they're majority minority populations racially, keep that in consideration when you're making decisions, because if you're saying you're racially neutral, class neutral, and then you're making decisions that majorly impact those communities, that's social inequity. So next, the book goes into principles of environmental justice, and it defines that as guaranteeing the right to environmental protection, preventing harm before it occurs, shifting the burden of proof to the polluters, obviating proof of intent to discriminate, and redressing existing inequities. The right to protection is pretty self-explanatory. It's basically saying everybody should be protected from environmental degradation and hazardous waste. Prevention of harm, which is defined as an elimination of a threat before harm occurs, should be the strategy of governments. So instead of after the fact trying to cure the ailments caused by toxins that were put in a community, instead just not putting the toxins in the community. There's a passage here that I want to read out because it's surprising, but also not surprising, but also very disappointing. It says, lead began to be phased out of gasoline in the 1970s. It is ironic that the regulations were initially developed to protect the newly developed catalytic converter in automobiles, a pollution-controlled device that happens to be rendered inoperative by lead, rather than to safeguard human health. In 1971, a child was not considered at risk unless he or she had 40 micrograms of lead per deciliter of blood. Since that time, the amount of lead that is considered safe has continually dropped. In 1991, the U.S. Public Health Service has changed the official definition of an unsafe level to 10 micrograms per deciliter. Even at that level, a child's IQ can be slightly diminished and physical growth stunted. As a little update, I looked it up, and in 2025, the CDC recognizes there are no safe levels of lead exposure. It does note, the CDC says that I believe it was 3.5 micrograms per deciliter was used to identify children with blood lead levels higher than most, but it is not saying that that is a safe level to be at. It's just the average. So people shouldn't be exposed to lead, but most people are, is what it's saying. Saying that if people are exposed to an amount higher than 3.5 micrograms per deciliter, then they take action. But even though below is not acceptable, because any amount isn't acceptable or safe, they only take action once it's above that. The book continues, lead poisoning is correlated with both income and race. It also says, even when differences in income are taken into account, middle-class African-American children are 3 times more likely to be poisoned with lead than are their middle-class white counterparts. So while it's correlated with income and race, the correlation with race is a little bit stronger, I believe, in that if a middle-class white person and a middle-class black person are both exposed to lead, the exposure in an African American person would be stronger because it's correlated to both. This next part is very frustrating. It says, in the spring of 1991, the Bush administration announced an ambitious program to reduce lead exposure of children, including widespread testing of homes, certification of those who remove lead from homes, and medical treatment for affected children. 6 months later, the Centers for Disease Control announced that the administration does not see this as a necessary federal role to legislate or regulate the cleanup of lead poisoning, to require homes be tested, to require homeowners to disclose results once they are known, or to establish standards for those who test or clean up lead hazards. So they're saying it's not necessary to clean up lead from homes. According to the New York Times, the National Association of Realtors pressured President Bush to drop his lead initiative because it feared that forcing homeowners to eliminate lead hazards would add from $5,000 to $10,000 to the price of those homes. further harming a real estate market already devastated by the aftershocks of Reaganomics. The public debate has pitted real estate and housing interests against public health interests. Right now, the housing interests appear to be winning. So the CDC and the Bush administration, after being pressured by realtors, found that it was more important to make houses more valuable and sell for more than it was to safeguard human health from lead poisoning. The book continues, for more than 2 decades, Congress and the nation's medical and public health establishments have been waffled, procrastinated, and shuffled papers while the lead problem steadily grows worse. During the years of President Reagan's benign neglect, funding dropped very low. Even in the best years, when funding has risen to as much as $50 million per year, it has never reached levels that would make a real dent in the problem. The book talks about how the laws, if they were enforced, would make a difference in lead issues, in lead exposure, but they're not enforced in African American communities. So I'm going to read another part of this. Living near the RSR and Dixie Metals smelters was associated with a 36% increase in childhood blood lead levels. The city was urged to restrict the emissions of lead into the atmosphere and to undertake a large screening program to determine the extent of the public health problem. The city failed to take immediate action to protect the residents who live near the smelters. In 1980, EPA, informed about possible health risks associated with the Dallas lead smelters, commissioned another lead screening study. This study confirmed what was already known a decade earlier. Children living near the Dallas smelters were likely to have greater lead concentrations in their blood than children who did not live near the smelters. The city only took action after the local newspapers published a series of headline-grabbing stories in 1983 on the potentially dangerous lead levels discovered by EPA researchers in 1981. The articles triggered widespread concern, public outrage, several class action lawsuits, and legal action by the Texas Attorney General. Although EPA was armed with a wealth of scientific data on the West Dallas lead problem, the agency chose to play politics with the community by scrapping a voluntary plan offered by RSR to clean up the hotspots in the neighborhood. John Hernandez, EPA's deputy administrator, blocked the cleanup and called for yet another round of tests to be designed by the Centers for Disease Control with EPA and the Dallas Health Department. The results of the new study were released in February 1983. The study again established the smelter as the source of elevated lead levels in West Dallas children. Hernandez's delay of cleanup actions in West Dallas was tantamount to waiting for a body count. That is crazy to me, that they saw there was a problem, they proved there was a problem, but instead of doing anything about it or taking the company that caused it, their offer to actually do something about it, even if that action wasn't enough, they could have said, okay, do that and a little bit more. Instead, they just said, don't do anything at all. We need to test to make sure that the thing that we already proved was harmful is harmful. So there was a lawsuit, class action lawsuit. The settlement was more than $45 million. RSR agreed to clean up the soil in West Dallas, blood testing program for children and pregnant women, and installation of new anti-pollution equipment. The settlement was made on behalf of 370 children, almost all of whom were poor black residents of the West Dallas Public Housing Project, and 40 property owners. The agreement was one of the largest community lead contamination settlements ever awarded in the United States. The settlement, however, did not require the smelter to close. Moreover, the pollution equipment for the smelter was never installed. So later on in 1984, the Dallas Board of Adjustments asked the city attorney to close the smelter permanently for violating the city's zoning code. It operated in the community of mostly African Americans in the West Dallas neighborhood for 50 years without having the necessary use permits. Just 4 months later, the West Dallas smelter was permanently closed. After repeated health citations, fines, and citizens' complaints against the smelter, one has to question the city's lax enforcement of health and land use regulations in African American and Latino neighborhoods. And then the book continues. The smelter is now closed. Although an initial cleanup was carried out in 1984, the lead problem has not gone away. So there are a couple other settlements that happened. One in California, Matthews v. Coy, about lead screening. But the book says that lead screening is important, but it's not the solution. New government-mandated lead abatement initiatives are needed. The nation needs a lead superfund cleanup program. Public health should not be sacrificed even in a sluggish housing market. Surely, if termite infestations required in both booming and sluggish housing markets can be mandated to protect individual home investment, a lead-free home can be mandated to protect human health. And I agree. I think that lead should not be in homes. That section of the chapter is concluded with, ultimately, the lead debate, public health, who is affected, versus property rights, who pays for cleanup, is a value conflict that will not be resolved by the scientific community. So this next part, shifting the burden of proof, is about how in the current system, people who are affected by pollution have to prove that they've been hurt by pollution instead of corporations proving that their methods are safe, instead of proving that they're non-discriminatory in their application of their laws, their policies, and their methods. So changing that burden of proof from being, okay, person who is affected by lead poisoning, prove to me that you've been hurt by lead poisoning, to, okay, company that wants to, have a lead factory in, this area, prove to me that you're not going to kill everyone in our neighborhood. So I'll read one of the cases in this section. A third case involves conditions surrounding the 1,900 maquiladoras, assembly plants operated by U.S., Japanese, and other countries' companies along the 2,000-mile U.S.-Mexican border. A 1983 agreement between the United States and Mexico requires U.S. companies in Mexico to export their waste products to the United States, and plants must notify EPA when they are doing so. However, a 1986 survey of 772 maquiladoras revealed that only 20 of the plants informed EPA when they were exporting waste to the United States, even though 86% of the plants used toxic chemicals in their manufacturing processes. And in 1989, only 10 waste shipment notices were filed with EPA. Much of the waste from the maquiladoras is illegally dumped in sewers, ditches, and the desert. All along the Rio Grande, plants dump toxic wastes into the river, from which 95% of the region's residents get their drinking water. In the border cities of Brownsville, Texas, and Matamoros, Mexico, the rate of anencephaly, being born without a brain, is 4 times the U.S. national average. Affected communities have filed lawsuits against 88 of the area's 100 maquiladoras for exposing the community to xylene, a cleaning solvent that can cause brain hemorrhages and lung and kidney damage. However, as usual, the burden of proof rests with the victims. Unfortunately, Mexico's environmental regulatory agencies is understaffed and ill-equipped to enforce the country's environmental laws adequately. So because the people who had their kids born without a brain because their brain hemorrhaged out of their body before they were born, they didn't have the funding to prove that they're being born without a brain at a higher rate than people who are not near this chemical was caused by the chemical. They couldn't do anything about it. So obviating proof of intent. It's saying that the impact of an action should be taken over the intent of an action. So for example, if and you can see this on a small scale too. If you do something that's discriminatory and you don't intend for it to be discriminatory, but the action itself is discriminatory, it's still a discriminatory action. And it's saying that that should be included in the law as well. That if something happens that is discriminatory in outcome, even if the person didn't say that they were discriminatory in intent, the outcome is still discriminatory and it should be treated as such. So it gives an example saying more than 83% of the residents in the subdivision owned their single-family detached homes. Thus, the Northwood Manor neighborhood was an unlikely candidate for a municipal landfill, except that in 1978 it was more than 82% black. An earlier attempt had been made to locate a municipal landfill in the same general area in 1970, when the subdivision and local school district had a majority white population. The 1970 landfill proposal was killed by the Harris County Board of Supervisors as being an incompatible land use. The site was deemed to be too close to a residential area and neighborhood school. In 1978, however, the controversial sanitary landfill was built only 1,400 feet from a high school, football stadium, track field, and the North Forest Independent School District's administration building. Because Houston has been and continues to be highly segregated, few Houstonians are unaware of where the African American neighborhoods end and the white ones begin. In 1970, for example, more than 90% of the city's African American residents lived in mostly black areas, and by 1980, 82% of Houston's African American population lived in mostly black areas. Houston is the only major U.S. city without zoning. In 1992, the City Council voted to institute zoning, but the measure was defeated at the polls in 1993. The city's African American neighborhoods have paid a high price for the city's unrestrained growth and a lack of zoning policy. Black Houston was allowed to become the dumping ground for the city's garbage. In every case, the racial composition of Houston's African American neighborhoods had been established before the waste facilities were sited. So the residents of Northwood Manor sued Southwestern Waste for discriminatory citing, and it said that the statistical evidence in the Bean v. Southwestern Waste overwhelmingly supported the disproportionate impact argument. However, the federal judge ruled against the plaintiffs on the grounds that purposeful discrimination was not demonstrated. So I think the book is saying, how are you supposed to prove that they were saying like, yes, let's put this waste in a black community? Like, you can't just get that. You can't like look into their diary and be like, oh, here's the racist paragraph right here. There's no way to prove that. And so having plaintiffs prove that they were discriminated against by intent rather than their outcome is only a way for corporations to get away with discrimination. I'm going to pause right there because I have to go to work, but I will finish chapter 1 in either the second part of this part, or I'll just upload this part and then complete it later on.